Sometimes the most dangerous moment in a man's life is not when he faces an enemy, but when he meets someone who makes him question the life he has always lived. On a quiet autumn night in New York City, rain drifted slowly across the glowing streetlights along a narrow avenue near the Hudson River. The sidewalks were nearly empty, the kind of calm that settles over the city after midnight, when most people have already gone home. Inside a small neighborhood cafe called Harbor Corner, Emily Carter was wiping down the last table before closing. The cafe was modest, with only 8 tables, soft yellow lights, and the steady smell of coffee that seemed to linger in the wooden walls no matter the season. Emily had been working there for almost 3 years. At 24 years old, she had grown used to long shifts, quiet nights, and the rhythm of customers coming and going. She lived in a small apartment 5 blocks away, a place barely large enough for a bed, a couch, and a small kitchen counter, but to Emily it was enough. Her life was simple. She worked during the evenings, studied online courses during the mornings, and tried to save what little money she could. She often told herself that life would get better one step at a time. That night felt like any other night until the cafe door opened again, just as she was about to turn off the lights above the counter. The bell above the door gave a soft chime. Emily looked up, slightly surprised. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in a dark coat, rain glistening faintly across the shoulders of the fabric. He paused for a moment, as if adjusting to the warm light of the room after the cold street outside. His presence immediately felt different from the usual customers who wandered in late at night. There was a calm confidence about him, the kind that made people instinctively notice without quite knowing why. Emily offered a polite smile, the kind she had given thousands of customers before. "We are almost closed," she said gently, "though there is still fresh coffee if you would like some." The man stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the quiet click echoing softly in the cafe. For a brief moment, the rain outside seemed to disappear from the world. He nodded once, his expression calm but thoughtful. "Coffee sounds perfect," he replied in a steady voice. Emily poured a cup and slid it across the counter. As she did, she noticed something about him. His movements were measured, deliberate, as if every action had a purpose. Most people who came in late at night looked tired or rushed. This man looked neither. Instead, he seemed strangely composed, like someone used to carrying responsibility that other people never saw. Emily handed him the cup. "Here you go." The man accepted it with a quiet thank you and sat at a table near the window where he could watch the rain sliding down the glass. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. Emily continued cleaning behind the counter, occasionally glancing toward the window where the stranger sat. There was something about him that made the quiet room feel different. Not tense, just different. Finally the man looked up and met her eyes across the room. In that brief moment, Emily felt something she could not quite explain, not fear and not excitement, but a sudden awareness that this quiet night might not remain ordinary after all. His name, though she did not know it yet, was Alexander Russo, and before this night ended both of their lives would begin moving toward a future neither of them had ever expected. The rain outside Harbor Corner Cafe continued long after the stranger finished his coffee, and even after he quietly stood up and placed a few bills on the table before leaving. Emily Carter locked the door that night with the same routine she followed every evening, yet something about the quiet room felt slightly different than before. Perhaps it was the memory of the man by the window or the calm way he had spoken, but the moment lingered in her thoughts longer than she expected. By the next morning the city had already moved on to another day, but the rhythm of Emily's life remained the same. She woke up in her small apartment just after 7 in the morning as pale sunlight slipped through the narrow blinds above her kitchen sink. The apartment was simple, barely 600 square feet, with a couch that had been passed down from a friend and a small round table where she usually studied during the early hours of the day. Emily brewed a cup of inexpensive coffee, opened her laptop, and continued working through an online business course she had started months earlier. Her goal was simple. One day she hoped to run a small cafe of her own somewhere quiet and welcoming, a place where people could slow down and talk without feeling rushed by the noise of the city. By late afternoon, she walked the familiar 5 blocks back to Harbor Corner Cafe to begin her evening shift. The neighborhood was calm compared to the crowded streets of Manhattan, and many of the customers were regulars who knew each other by name. Around 8:30 that evening, the bell above the door chimed softly again. Emily looked up from behind the counter, and immediately recognized the tall man from the night before. He stepped inside with the same quiet composure, wearing another dark coat that still carried faint traces of the cool evening air outside. For a moment, Emily wondered if it was coincidence or intention that had brought him back. She offered the same friendly smile she gave every customer. "Good evening," she said. The man nodded politely as he approached the counter. "Good evening," he replied in the same steady voice she remembered. "Coffee again if you still have it." Emily poured a fresh cup and placed it on the counter. The cafe was busier than the night before, filled with the low murmur of conversations and the occasional sound of dishes being placed on tables. Yet when the stranger took his seat near the window once again, the same quiet sense of calm seemed to follow him. Emily noticed that he did not check his phone like most customers. He simply watched the street outside, as if observing the world at a slower pace than everyone else. After a few minutes, he looked toward the counter. "You work here every evening, do not you?" he asked. Emily nodded as she wiped down the espresso machine. "Most nights," she said. "It is a small place, so we keep a simple schedule." The man gave a slight smile that seemed genuine but reserved. "It is a good place," he said. "Quiet." Emily laughed softly. "Quiet is rare in this city." The man looked around the cafe for a moment before replying. "Sometimes quiet places are the most important ones." Emily did not know why that comment stayed with her long after the conversation ended, but it did. What she did not realize was that the man sitting near the window was not simply passing time. For Alexander Russo, returning to Harbor Corner Cafe was not an accident at all. Over the next several evenings, the pattern quietly repeated itself, and Emily Carter began to notice that the tall stranger with the calm voice seemed to arrive at Harbor Corner Cafe at nearly the same time each night. Usually sometime after 8:30 when the dinner crowd had faded and the cafe settled into its slower rhythm. At first she assumed it was coincidence, the kind of small routine many customers developed without thinking much about it. But after the fourth evening, she realized something was different about this particular guest. He always chose the same table by the window facing the street, and he always ordered the same simple cup of coffee without asking for sugar or cream. Emily eventually learned his name on the fifth evening when he placed his payment on the counter, and she noticed the name printed on the credit card before handing it back to him. Alexander Russo. The name sounded strong and formal, yet he spoke with the relaxed tone of someone who preferred quiet conversations over attention. Emily repeated the name softly as she returned the card. "Thank you, Mr. Russo." He gave a small nod as if the moment was ordinary, though in truth he rarely allowed strangers to address him so casually. Most people in his world spoke to him carefully, choosing their words with caution and respect. Inside Harbor Corner Cafe, however, the rules of his life seemed to soften in ways he had not expected. Over the following days, their conversations slowly grew longer. They spoke about simple things that filled the ordinary lives of most people in the city. Emily talked about the neighborhood and the customers she had known for years. She mentioned the elderly couple who visited every Sunday afternoon and always shared one slice of apple pie between them. She described the college student who studied in the corner every evening while preparing for medical school exams. Alexander listened carefully to every story, as if these small details carried more meaning than business meetings or formal dinners ever had. Occasionally he asked questions about her life as well. Emily explained that she had grown up in a small town in Ohio nearly 600 miles away and had moved to New York 4 years earlier with the hope of building something meaningful on her own. She told him about the online business courses she studied during the mornings and her dream of someday opening a cafe that felt welcoming to everyone who walked through the door. Alexander seemed genuinely interested in these dreams. For him, the idea of working towards something simple and honest felt strangely unfamiliar. His own life had been shaped by responsibilities and decisions that few people outside his world would ever fully understand. Yet when he sat at that table beside the rain-streaked window listening to Emily speak about her future, the complicated structure of his usual days seemed to fade quietly into the background. One evening, as the cafe grew quieter and the sound of traffic softened outside, Emily asked a question she had not considered before. "So what do you do for work, Mr. Russo?" The question hung gently in the air between them. Alexander paused for a brief moment before answering. "I manage a few business interests around the city," he said calmly. The answer was technically true, but carefully incomplete. Emily simply nodded and smiled as she wiped the counter. That sounds busy. New York never slows down. Alexander looked around the warm room once more before replying. Sometimes that is why places like this matter so much. Emily did not know exactly what he meant by that statement, but she sensed there was more behind his words than he was willing to explain. What she could not see was that Alexander Russo had begun rearranging parts of his schedule without telling anyone. Also, he could sit quietly at a small table inside Harbor Corner Cafe for 1 hour each evening, watching the rain fall across the streets of New York while listening to the voice of a woman whose world was completely different from his own. By the time the second week arrived, Emily Carter had grown used to seeing Alexander Russo sitting by the window almost every evening, and the routine had become so natural that it felt as though he had always been part of the quiet rhythm inside Harbor Corner Cafe. The weather in New York had begun to cool as autumn slowly settled over the city, and the early darkness outside made the warm lights of the cafe glow even brighter against the street. One evening, just after 9 o'clock, the last few customers finished their drinks and left, leaving the cafe unusually calm except for the soft sound of jazz music playing from the small speaker above the counter. Emily finished stacking a few clean cups before walking toward the table where Alexander sat. "You always seem to choose the quietest time of the night to visit," she said with a light smile. Alexander looked up from the street outside, where thin lines of rain were sliding down the window. "Quiet evenings are easier to think in," he replied. Emily laughed softly as she sat in the chair across from him for the first time since he began visiting. "I always thought the same thing when I was younger," she said. "Back home in Ohio, everything was quiet all the time. The biggest noise you heard at night was usually a passing truck on the highway or a dog barking somewhere far away." Alexander listened with interest. "That sounds peaceful," he said. "Sometimes it was," Emily answered. "Though when you grow up in a small town, you eventually feel like the whole world is somewhere else. That is why I came here." Alexander tilted his head slightly. "To New York?" Emily nodded. "I wanted to see more of the world and build something of my own." She paused for a moment before continuing. "One day I hope to open a cafe that feels like home to people who walk in. A place where nobody feels rushed or ignored." Alexander studied the expression on her face as she spoke about the dream. There was a sincerity in her voice that felt rare in the circles he normally moved through. Most people he encountered every day spoke about profit, influence, and expansion. Emily spoke about comfort, warmth, and connection. That difference stayed in his mind long after she finished talking. A few minutes passed while the rain outside slowly turned into a gentle drizzle. Emily stood up to refill his coffee before sitting again across from him. "You never really talk about your own life, Mr. Russo," she said with a curious tone. "I feel like I have told you half of mine already." Alexander smiled faintly. "My life is not very interesting to talk about," he said. Carefully, Emily raised an eyebrow in a playful way. "I do not believe that for a second. Everyone has a story." Alexander looked out the window again before answering. "Some stories are complicated." Emily leaned back in the chair and folded her arms lightly. "Complicated does not mean uninteresting. Sometimes those are the most meaningful ones." Alexander turned his attention back to her, studying the honesty in her words. In that moment, something shifted quietly inside his thoughts. For years, he had built a life defined by control and careful distance. Yet sitting across from Emily Carter in a small neighborhood cafe, he realized he was experiencing something unfamiliar. For the first time in a very long time, he was enjoying a conversation without calculating its purpose. As the clock behind the counter moved closer to closing time, Emily finally stood up to begin turning off a few of the lights. Alexander finished his coffee and slowly stood as well. "Thank you for the conversation," he said sincerely. Emily smiled as she walked him toward the door. "You are welcome, Mr. Russo. Same time tomorrow." Alexander paused briefly before stepping into the cool New York night. "Yes," he said quietly. "Tomorrow sounds good." Over the next several days, the quiet routine inside Harbor Corner Cafe continued. Yet something about the atmosphere between Emily Carter and Alexander Russo had begun to shift in a way that neither of them openly acknowledged. Autumn in New York had grown cooler, and the air outside carried the faint scent of rain and fallen leaves each evening when the city lights flickered on across the streets. Emily noticed that Alexander still arrived around the same time every night, usually after the busiest customers had left and the cafe returned to its calm rhythm. By now she no longer felt surprised when the bell above the door chimed, and he stepped inside wearing his familiar dark coat. Instead, it felt almost expected, as if the quiet hour of conversation they shared had become a natural part of both of their days. One evening the cafe was especially slow. Only 2 customers remained seated near the front window, speaking quietly over tea before leaving shortly after 9:30. When the door closed behind them, the room fell into the comfortable silence that Emily had always loved about the place. She finished cleaning a table and walked toward Alexander with a fresh cup of coffee, even though he had not asked for one yet. "You seem to know my routine better than I do now," he said with a small smile as she placed the cup in front of him. Emily shrugged playfully. "That is part of the job. After a while you notice what people like before they even say anything." Alexander studied her expression for a moment. "You are very observant." Emily leaned against the edge of the table. "I think running a place like this someday will require that. When people feel noticed, they feel comfortable." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "That is something many successful places forget." Emily smiled and sat down across from him again. The rain had begun outside once more, tapping softly against the glass window beside their table. For a few moments, they simply watched the reflections of passing headlights moving across the wet street. Finally, Emily spoke again. "Do you ever get tired of the city, Mr. Russo?" Alexander looked out at the rain as he considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly. "Cities move quickly. It can be difficult to slow down." Emily nodded. "That is true. But sometimes slowing down is exactly what people need." She paused for a moment before continuing. "That is why I think places like this matter." Alexander turned his attention back toward her, remembering the same words he had once said to her during his first visits. "You believe that very strongly, do not you?" Emily smiled gently. "I do. When people walk in here, they leave their problems outside for a little while, even if it is just for 15 minutes. Alexander studied her face again, noticing the sincerity behind every word. In his world, conversations were often strategic or guarded, but with Emily, everything felt unexpectedly genuine. As the evening moved closer to closing time, Emily stood up and began wiping the nearby counter while Alexander finished the last of his coffee. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, turning the streetlights into soft, glowing halos through the water on the glass. When Alexander finally stood to leave, Emily walked with him toward the door as she had done many evenings before. But this time something different caught her attention as he reached into his coat pocket. His phone lit up briefly with a message on the screen, and in that short moment, Emily noticed several missed calls from contacts whose names sounded unfamiliar and unusually formal. One of the names included the word security beside it. Alexander noticed her brief glance and calmly turned the screen dark before placing the phone back in his pocket. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily offered a polite smile as she opened the door for him. "Good night, Mr. Russo." He paused before stepping outside into the rain and gave a small nod. "Good night, Emily." As he disappeared into the dimly lit street, Emily stood quietly behind the door for a moment longer than usual. Something about that brief flash of names on his phone left her with a strange feeling that the man she had come to know over the past 2 weeks might be living a life far more complicated than he had ever allowed her to see. The following evening, the air over the Hudson River carried a colder wind than usual, and Emily Carter noticed it immediately when she stepped outside Harbor Corner Cafe for a moment before her shift began. Autumn had now fully settled into the city, and the sky above Manhattan faded into darkness earlier each day. When she returned inside and turned on the warm lights of the cafe, the familiar smell of coffee and baked pastries slowly filled the room once again. Yet something in her thoughts felt slightly unsettled after what she had seen on Alexander Russo's phone the night before. It was not fear exactly, but a quiet curiosity that refused to disappear. She told herself there was probably a simple explanation. After all, many business people received constant calls from colleagues and assistants. Still, the word security stayed in her mind longer than she expected. The evening customers arrived gradually, filling the small tables with quiet conversations and the sound of spoons gently tapping against ceramic cups. Emily worked behind the counter with the same friendly rhythm she always had, greeting regular visitors and preparing drinks without needing to ask for their usual orders. Around 8:45, the bell above the cafe door chimed again. Emily glanced up instinctively and saw Alexander step inside from the cool night air. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. Normally, she would immediately smile and greet him the way she always did, But tonight there was a brief hesitation in her expression. That Alexander noticed almost instantly. He walked toward the counter calmly as usual. "Good evening, Emily," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Russo," she replied while pouring his coffee. Her voice was polite and warm, yet something about her tone carried a subtle distance that had not been there before. Alexander sensed it immediately, even though he could not yet identify the reason. He carried the cup toward his usual seat by the window while Emily returned to the counter. The cafe was busier than most nights, and for nearly 20 minutes they did not speak again. Alexander watched the rain beginning to form faint lines on the glass outside while quietly observing the room. Eventually, the customers slowly began to leave until only 2 people remained at a distant table. Emily walked toward Alexander with a small towel in her hands as she finished wiping nearby surfaces. "You seem quiet tonight," he said gently. Emily gave a small, uncertain smile. "Just thinking about things." Alexander studied her expression carefully. "Did something happen?" Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yesterday when your phone lit up, I saw the names on the screen." She quickly added before he could respond. "I was not trying to read it. It just happened." Alexander remained silent for a few seconds, considering his words. The truth was complicated, far more complicated than the calm atmosphere of Harbor Corner Café would ever suggest. Emily continued speaking softly. "You once told me your life was complicated. I think I understand that a little more now." Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair and looked toward the window again before replying. "Some parts of my life involve responsibilities that are difficult to explain." Emily nodded slowly. "I guess something like that." She paused again before continuing. "I just want to be sure I am not misunderstanding who you are." Alexander turned his attention back to her. "And what do you think you are misunderstanding?" Emily folded her arms lightly and looked at the rain outside for a moment before answering. "I do not know yet. That is what worries me." Her honesty hung quietly in the warm air of the cafe. Alexander realized that the peaceful world he had been enjoying here could not remain separated from the reality of his life forever. For the first time since he began visiting Harbor Corner Café, he understood that Emily Carter was beginning to see the edge of a truth he had carefully kept hidden. For a long moment after Emily Carter spoke those words, the cafe felt unusually quiet, even though the rain outside continued tapping softly against the window beside their table. Alexander Russo did not answer immediately. He had spent most of his adult life carefully controlling what people knew about him and what they did not. In his world, information was power and silence was protection. Yet sitting across from Emily inside the warm glow of Harbor Corner Café, he realized that the distance he had always maintained between his real life and this quiet place could not remain untouched forever. Emily stood still beside the table with her arms folded lightly, not angry and not afraid, simply waiting for an honest answer. Finally, Alexander exhaled slowly and looked toward the street again before speaking. "You are not misunderstanding anything about the person you have seen here," he said calmly. "The conversations we have had and the time I spend in this cafe are real to me." Emily studied his face carefully. "That is not what I meant," she replied gently. "I am not questioning the conversations. I am questioning the parts you are not telling me about." Alexander nodded once, as if acknowledging the fairness of her concern. "Some of those parts are not easy to explain," he said. Emily pulled out the chair across from him and sat down again. "Then start with something simple," she said quietly. Alexander remained silent for several seconds. Outside, a taxi passed slowly through the rain, its headlights reflecting across the wet pavement and briefly lighting the cafe window beside them. "I work in an environment where people rely on me to make difficult decisions," Alexander finally said. Emily tilted her head slightly. "That sounds like half the people who work in this city." Alexander allowed a faint smile to appear. "Perhaps. But my responsibilities come with expectations that are very different from most businesses." Emily watched him closely. "Are you in danger?" she asked softly. Alexander shook his head slowly. "Not in the way you are imagining." His answer was truthful yet incomplete, and he knew it. Emily looked down at the table for a moment, thinking carefully before speaking again. "When I came to New York, I promised myself something," she said. "I promised that I would build a life around honesty and calm because I grew up watching people make choices that created chaos around them." She lifted her eyes back toward him. "I like the conversations we have had, Mr. Russo, but I need to know that the people in my life are not bringing something dangerous into it." Alexander listened to her words with more attention than anyone had ever demanded from him before. In his world, loyalty was expected and questions were rarely encouraged. Emily, however, spoke with the quiet courage of someone who valued peace more than mystery. After a long pause, Alexander leaned forward slightly. "Emily," he said carefully, "the world I come from is complicated, and sometimes people misunderstand it when they see it from the outside. But I would never allow harm to come near you or this place." Emily noticed the seriousness in his voice. "That sounds like a promise," she said. "It is," Alexander replied. Emily leaned back slowly in her chair, as if considering everything he had said. For the first time since she noticed the message on his phone the night before, the tension in her expression softened slightly. "I believe you when you say that," she said quietly. "But promises are easier to make than they are to keep." Alexander nodded in agreement. "That is true." Outside, the rain continued falling steadily across the dark streets of New York, while the warm lights of Harbor Corner Café reflected against the glass. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Yet both understood that something important had just shifted between them. Emily Carter had begun asking questions that reached beyond the calm conversations they once shared, and Alexander Russo realized that the peaceful world he had discovered inside this small cafe might soon require a decision he had never expected to face. The following evening arrived with a strange quiet that Emily Carter noticed the moment she unlocked the door of Harbor Corner Café. The sky above New York carried a pale gray color that hinted at another night of rain, and the cool air drifting through the street made the warm lights inside the cafe feel even more comforting than usual. Yet despite the familiar atmosphere, something about the day felt different to her. The conversation with Alexander Russo the night before had stayed in her thoughts long after she returned home. She had replayed every word in her mind while lying awake in her small apartment, wondering if she had been too direct or if she had simply said what needed to be said. By the time the evening shift began, she had decided on one thing. She would continue treating Alexander the same way she always had. Whatever complicated world he lived in outside the cafe did not have to control what happened inside it. Around 8:30, the bell above the door chimed softly once again. Emily looked up from the espresso machine and saw Alexander step inside with the same composed presence he always carried. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily smiled in the natural way she always had before. "Good evening, Mr. Russo." Alexander returned the smile with quiet relief that he did not try to hide. "Good evening, Emily. Coffee as usual?" she asked while already reaching for a cup. "Yes, please." The routine felt familiar again, yet beneath the surface both of them understood that something had changed. When Alexander moved toward his usual seat by the window, Emily noticed that he seemed more thoughtful than usual. The rain had not started yet, but dark clouds hung over the streetlights outside as if the sky was waiting for the right moment. After a few minutes, Emily walked over with the coffee and sat across from him without saying anything at first. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It felt more like two people trying to understand what came next. "I thought about what you said yesterday," Alexander finally began. Emily raised her eyebrows slightly. "That can be dangerous. Thinking too much often leads people to complicated conclusions." Alexander gave a faint laugh at the remark. "Perhaps that is true, but you were right about one thing. People deserve honesty from those who enter their lives." Emily watched him carefully. "Are you about to tell me something important?" Alexander paused as if measuring the words before speaking them. "My life has been built around power and responsibility for a long time. It is a world where most relationships are based on advantage rather than trust." Emily listened quietly without interrupting. Alexander continued speaking in the calm tone that always seemed natural to him. "When I first walked into this cafe, I was simply looking for a quiet place to think. I did not expect to find a person who reminded me what a normal conversation felt like." Emily lowered her gaze briefly before looking back up at him. "I am glad the coffee helped," she said with a small smile. "It was not the coffee," Alexander replied gently. "It was you." The words hung softly in the air between them. Emily felt a slight warmth rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I think what you really found here was a break from whatever your usual life looks like." Alexander nodded slowly. "That may be true, but sometimes a break from something allows you to see it more clearly." Emily leaned back in her chair, watching the street outside where the first drops of rain finally began to fall. "And what do you see now?" she asked quietly. Alexander looked at the window for a moment before answering. I see a life that I built carefully for many years, and I also see the possibility that it might not be the only path I could follow. Emily did not respond immediately. The rain outside grew steadier, tracing thin silver lines across the glass. In that moment, she realized that the calm routine of Harbor Corner Café had begun to change Alexander Russo in ways that even he had not fully expected. The rain continued falling outside Harbor Corner Café as the evening moved slowly toward closing time, and the soft sound of water tapping against the windows created the calm atmosphere Emily Carter had always loved about the place. The street outside had grown quieter, with only the occasional car passing through the reflections of the wet pavement under the streetlights. Inside the cafe, only 2 cups remained on the table by the window where she and Alexander Russo sat, facing each other in thoughtful silence. Emily was the first to speak again. When people say they might choose a different path in life, she said gently, it usually means something has already started changing inside them. Alexander looked at the thin lines of rain sliding down the glass before answering. That is exactly what it means. For most of his life, Alexander had believed that the direction he followed was permanent. Every decision he had made had strengthened the structure of the world he lived in, and stepping away from that structure had never been something he seriously considered. Yet during the past few weeks, the quiet conversations inside this small cafe had introduced a new idea he could not easily ignore. Emily Carter represented a life that was simple in the best possible way. Her days were built around honest work, small ambitions, and genuine connections with people around her. The more Alexander observed that life, the more he realized how distant it was from his own. Emily studied his expression carefully. You are thinking about leaving something behind, she said softly. Alexander nodded once. I believe I am beginning to. Emily did not look surprised by the answer. Instead, she rested her hands on the table and considered his words thoughtfully. People do not usually change their lives overnight, she said. It happens slowly. First they question the path they are on. Then they begin imagining another one. Alexander smiled faintly at the accuracy of her description. And what happens after that? He asked. Emily glanced toward the counter where the small clock on the wall showed it was almost closing time. After that, she replied, they decide whether they have the courage to follow the new path or return to the old one because it feels familiar. Alexander absorbed those words quietly. For the first time in many years, he felt uncertain about a decision that only he could make. The rain outside had now grown lighter, and the clouds above the city were slowly drifting away to reveal the glow of distant lights across the skyline. Emily stood up and began collecting the empty cups from the table, while Alexander remained seated for a moment longer. When she returned from the counter, she stopped beside him and looked toward the street outside. New York always looks calmer after the rain, she said. Alexander followed her gaze through the window. It does. Emily turned toward him again with the same warm sincerity that had defined every conversation they shared. Whatever path you choose, Mr. Russo, I hope it leads you somewhere that feels peaceful. Alexander stood slowly and placed his coat over his arm. For the first time since he began visiting Harbor Corner Café, his answer carried a quiet certainty that had not existed before. I believe it already has, he said. Emily smiled gently as she walked with him toward the door. When Alexander stepped outside, the rain had almost completely stopped, leaving the city washed clean under the soft glow of streetlights. For a moment he paused on the sidewalk and looked back through the cafe window where Emily was turning off the lights one by one. In that simple scene, he saw something more valuable than any achievement his old life had ever offered. And as he turned to walk down the quiet street, Alexander Russo realized that the future he had once believed was fixed had begun to change the very moment he stepped into a small cafe and met a woman who reminded him that another kind of life was still possible.